Welcome to the Morrison Report. Hosted by Deval Morrison, sales representative for Bosley Real Estate Limited Brokerage. Ms. Morrison has co-authored the best-selling book, Success Today, with Brian Tracy, and has been interviewed on NBC, ABC, and CBS affiliates by Bob Guinea from The Bachelor. Deval, a real estate investor, has spoken to many attendees at her real estate seminars and is currently ranked in the top 5% of agents in her brokerage. Join me in welcoming your host, Deval Morrison.
On today's episode, we have Ben Myers, Senior Vice President of Market Research Analytics at Fortress Real Development. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome, thanks. So tell us a little bit more. What do you do at Fortress and how does it relate to real estate?
Sure. So Fortress Real Development is a real estate development company. We partner with other builder developers on most of our development projects. A lot of them, our major responsibility is sourcing equity, sourcing debt financing, and helping the development along more on the financial side as opposed to the construction side of things. So what I do is I underwrite or do the due diligence on the deals that are presented to us, either from a developer or a broker. I look at them from a revenue perspective. So I look at, what the unit can sell for. Is it the right market that we want to be in? Is it the right neighborhood? Is it the right built form? Is it the right product type? Is it the right unit size? Is it the right mix of units, the right amenities, the right features and finishes? And that's kind of where my level of expertise comes in. And then on top of that, I kind of produce reports for our stakeholders, either, general public, folks that raise capital on our behalf, or development partners on, macro level trends that are happening at a national level, that are happening at a municipal level, and are happening on a neighborhood level. So that's kind of my main focus at Fortress.
Perfect. That's great. That's very broad. One of the things that you touched on was in terms of, you're researching trends. So in terms of trends and sizes of condos, what are your thoughts about people saying that people are going to be starting to raise their families in condos? Do you see that as a valid trend in your business? What are you seeing?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I did a survey of realtors recently, and for my next market manuscript report, which is a kind of a robust report that I put out to the market on trends. So I went and asked realtors what they thought. So it was interesting that a lot of them thought that, yes, the next 5 to 10 years, that's going to be a big trend. And even a few of them indicated that they've already sold a number of condominiums to families. And I think it's inevitable that it's going to happen. I think it's going to be obviously a slow process, but it's a necessity to live in the Greater Toronto area for us to expand vertically. There's a really tight supply in the Greater Toronto area, especially in the core. We're essentially built out of any what we call greenfield lands in the city of Toronto, Mississauga, Scarborough, North York. There's very little land available that for low-rise housing unless you're demolishing a strip mall or something that's already existing. There's very little land to just do massive single-family detached communities. If people want that, they're being forced to drive farther out or pay very, very high fees. So if people want to stay in the city, they're looking at alternatives to spend more time with their family and spend less time in their car. So they're looking at buying condominiums to kind of service their needs. So it'll be interesting to see how that trend starts to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And what would you say about the condo supply in Toronto right now? Do you think it's adequate? Do you think it's inadequate? There's always lots of talk about, we're facing a condo bubble. They're building too many units. What do you say to people like that, Ben?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. For the longest time, we were delivering in and around 10 to 15,000 new condominiums a year in Toronto, and that had, it served the market fairly well. We had a major sales boom in 2011, which resulted in somewhere in the neighborhood of about 25,000 new condominium sales. So you give those projects a year in pre-construction and then 2 to 3 years under construction. We saw a major increase in the second half of 2014. Into 2015, just a lot of projects coming to completion. So I think for a 12-month stretch there, I think we had about 26,000, 27,000 completions bordering on 30,000 completions in a like a 26, 28 month period. So just a lot of supply came online. And the amazing thing that happened is they all got sucked up, and everyone expected there to be at least some flatness in the market, but if anything, it started to pick up. So Very interesting. It totally wasn't expected with that major level of increased supply that we would continue to see prices gain, and not only gain, but gain more than they had in the past. So I think people want to be in Toronto. I think young people aspire to come to the big city from London to Guelph to Kitchener to Brantford to Windsor. Obviously, a lot of people are going to stay in a Kingston or in Ottawa or somewhere farther west. But I think a lot of people desire to come to Toronto, and if we can keep producing high volumes of condominiums and keep the prices relatively in check. For a lot of people, $300,000 seems like a lot of money, but in a global sense, in a city of our size, in a region of our size, to still be able to house a single person in $250,000 to $300,000 for a unit is pretty affordable. So I want to see as many new condos as we can produce, and that doesn't result in an oversupply situation, because I just think it's an inclusive city, a city that can have first-time buyers and young people in their 20s. It's just a huge advantage. Obviously, we're seeing what's happening in Vancouver with people getting priced out and young people actually deciding to leave the city because of affordability issues, right? So that's obviously anecdotal. I haven't looked at the latest census to see how much of that is happening, but we want people to come to Toronto and live in Toronto and start their careers here and be able to afford housing. I think cities are best when they're able to provide housing from someone that's 22 years old all the way up to someone that's 90 years old.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. It's funny. The one thing I've noticed in resale condos this year is that, or the last few months, is that as an agent, if I don't get my client into a great condo within the first 48 hours, it's sold. And so a lot of condos now are actually just having offer dates the same way that they do for houses, because, as much as people kept talking about there's too much supply, it actually appears that in the condo world there isn't enough supply of what people want, and so it's causing bidding wars for condos. And I think that's something that people really never thought coming, given all the doom and gloom out there about overbuilding. But when I'm sort of working day in and day out, I certainly don't see that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what's happened. I see the majority of the downtown condominiums, like pre-construction new condominiums, are being bought by investors, and a lot of those investors are looking to rent them out long term. They believe in a long-term appreciation. They believe in the rental market, and we've seen the rental market rates appreciate at a fairly brisk rate recently. So a lot of the small units are being rented out because investors tend to like those small units. Yep. Developers are not building as many of the larger units that a lot of the end users desire. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between what's getting built in pre-construction and what's actually being demanded in the resale market, right? Yeah. So it's creating an inflation in the larger units, and in the smaller units, there's still some competition because a lot of those small units are in the rental market as opposed to in the resale market. So it's interesting how the market is evolving. We're starting to see developers now adding more larger units to their pre-construction buildings, because there's obviously investors that only want to be in 1 or 2 years after registration, so they see the value in having some larger units and being able to sell those in a market where there's not a lot of them. So they see the trends coming and they're buying into them. And obviously there's still end users that buy in the new markets, not 100% investors. There's still people there, they're living in a condominium now, and they say, you know what, in 3 years I'm ready to move up to something larger. I can see the writing on the wall in the low-rise housing market. It's going up, anywhere from 10 to 20% year over year, depending on the month. Yep. So, in 3 years from now, when I'm actually ready to make that move, it may be just so out of reach that, I'm not comfortable with it. So why don't I buy in a pre-construction condominium and I can either move in it, or, if my employment situation has changed, maybe I rent it out and, maybe rent the rooms out. So there's a lot of different options for people out there, especially with such a strong rental market. So people are looking at it in several different angles when they're going into a office to buy a new condo.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things you touched on is the investors, and maybe we could talk a little bit about the foreign market, because it's certainly in the news quite a bit. And I always wonder, why can't they measure what the foreign ownership levels are in Canada? I mean, I find it interesting that the state of Florida seems to know, over the last couple of years, that Canadians were the largest buyers of real estate in their state, and then recently the Chinese beat out the Canadians. And I always think to myself, how is it that the state of Florida is so buttoned down that they know their percentages, but our country cannot figure that out? So what's the answer to that? Why can't we get why can't we get our act together?
Yeah, well, I think we're the government have made a kind of a mandate to start tracking that information to get it more buttoned up. But I mean, I think the issue that I've said several times in the past is it's foreign capital, not forein buyers that is buying real estate. And the important thing is they have people that live here. They're not just throwing a dart at a board and saying, okay, should I buy Toronto? Should I buy Vancouver? Should I buy Miami, New York, San Francisco? They generally buy into areas they're familiar with, and that often means they have relatives living here, they have friends living here, and they may actually even have their spouse living here, and they're planning on moving here, right? So anytime you see an actual foreign buyer on the list of pre-construction condominium project, they generally have some type of tie here. Their child is going here as a student. They plan on trying to move here. But on the other hand, yes, there's a lot of locals that are buying, but the money is coming from grandpa or grandma or a relative overseas, and they're funding some of these purchases, right? So that's why it makes it so much more difficult to track. Like I've said to people, if I had relatives in England, if one of them passed on and gave me inheritance, and then I took this inheritance, and next year I decided to buy a couple condos with it. Well, it's foreign money, but it's not as certainly not a foreign buy because I purchased it. And how do you ever track funds that are coming into this country and what they are eventually used for, 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line or 4 years down the line, right? It's virtually impossible to do it, right? So that's what makes it much more difficult. So that's why I think that the foreign tax is not going to have a huge impact once 2 years or 3 years down the line in Vancouver. And obviously, I wouldn't recommend a similar tax in Toronto.
And so it's funny because I had chatted with a friend of mine whose family members were real estate agents out in BC, and they felt that because the tax was enacted literally right away, that there were deals that hadn't closed yet that all of a sudden were going to be affected by the tax. So there are people now that couldn't close on deals that they had actually bought already. So I thought that was interesting that they didn't sort of give people enough notice to say, okay, if you already have your deal done, don't worry about the tax. It's going to be for any new deals from a particular day forward, Yeah,
it should have been grandfathered in, and it made absolutely no sense. It's really unfair for everyone wants to think it's money laundering, rich Chinese people that are buying all the condominiums. But there's a PhD student that just finished his master's degree at UBC, and he's starting a new job. Just bought a condominium unit, and his closing date is August the 4th, right? And he wants to become a Canadian citizen, right? They're screwing these people, right? They're responding to the people that are speaking the loudest, and a lot of those people, it's xenophobic in nature, and it's disappointing, right? The major issue that's impacting the Vancouver housing market is just a lack of supply. They are building vertically, obviously, but there's still huge demand, and same thing happening in Toronto. People like low-rise housing, right? So they bid those prices up very, very high, and then there's restrictions in Vancouver in terms of heights on buildings, in terms of infringing on residential neighborhoods. There's just all kinds of restrictions on buildings, so the market can't effectively respond to the demand, right? And then obviously, in any of the coastal cities, you have the issue of a geographic constraint on where you can build, right? People just don't seem to understand that the reason that prices in Calgary and Edmonton Boston don't go up as much as Vancouver and Toronto was they can expand in 360 degrees, essentially around the city. They're newer cities where the core is not where all the employment is, where some of the older cities, the employment was stuck right near the water, right? So that's why you see areas like Boston and New York and San Francisco, their prices going through the roof because they have a constraint on people getting to where the major jobs are, right? I mean, Toronto,